Welcome to Level Up Your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. We are going to build a website and a Dockerfile and push this up to Kubernetes, all live on stage. Here's the part where I tell you I am definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. Have you heard that yet today? Did it work? Well, the cool part in this presentation, there are no slides. That's it. Those are my slides. The cool part is that the code is up on GitHub right now. Here's our GitHub repository. And everything we're going to do is going to go into that GitHub repository. So that GitHub repository is right here, github.com/levelupdevops GitHub Actions Kubernetes. Or an easier way to get there, let's head off to robrich.org, robrich.org, click on presentations, and here's Level Up Your DevOps with GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. The code is online right now. Achievement unlocked, woo! While we're on robrich.org, let's click on About Me and see some of the things that I've done recently. Docker and Microsoft have given me some awards. I'm a friend of Redgate. And AZ GiveCamp is really fun. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start building software Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software to charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp. Or if you'd like a GiveCamp here in LA or wherever you're connecting from, then find me here at the event or hit me up on any of the socials, and let's get a GiveCamp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done a lot with Docker and Kubernetes. I got the Tip of the Captain's Hat Award a few years ago. That was a lot of fun. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of, I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comments on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! And if you'd like a mug, no, I'm just kidding. So let's go build some stuff. Now I have here an empty Kubernetes cluster, an empty folder, and so let's go build a website. Now to be able to publish a website, we need to have one, so let's say .NET New. Now .NET New gives us a bunch of options of how we might choose to scaffold a website. We could definitely do this in Node or Go or Python, but I'll just do it here. I'll give it a name of Level Up DevOps and an output folder of dot. Now both name and output are optional, but if I didn't give it a name, it would use my folder name, so demo, and then it would create another folder inside that also called demo and put the site there. So now we've got a website. Let's open this up in VS Code. And here we can see that we've got, well, a standard website. We have controllers. Here's our index controller. We have views. Here's our index view. And it says, welcome to DevOps, to DockerCon 2023. Woohoo! We've got a website. Now our next step to be able to get this website into a repository, oh, do I want to grab our missing assets? Yeah, sure. It'll create me this .vs code folder that'll help me if I'm locally debugging this. Our next step is a gitignore file. .gitignore. Now here in the gitignore file, we want to ignore 5 types of content. We want to ignore everything that will make our repository bigger, but not necessarily more valuable. So our first thing is downloaded files. Next is built files. Have you ever checked in your built assets and then somebody else does and you hit that merge conflict where it's like the debug folder? Yeah, I hate when I do that. Next up, we want to ignore user-specific files. And then we want to ignore temp files. And finally, we want to ignore secrets. These are the 5 types of files that we don't want in our Git repository because they'll expose us to security vulnerabilities or just make our repository unnecessarily big. Now, if I was in a Node project, downloaded things, I would have Node modules. I might have PyCache. That's arguably temp files instead. So let's go grab that and set that in temp files. But here in a .NET project, I might have a packages folder if I'm in an older version of .NET. But here in this one, we don't have that. So we don't have any downloaded files. Excellent. Built files. We have the bin and obj folder. We might have a dist folder if we're building in another environment. but bin and obj will get us in this case. User-specific files. We might have star.user. We might have a .vs folder if we open this in Visual Studio, a different IDE. Is this VS Code folder user-specific? It isn't yet, because I haven't changed it, but yeah, let's ignore that. .vs Code. We'll probably also ignore .idea. Temp files. Well, we definitely want the .ds store ignored, the Mac temp files. We don't want those anywhere near this. We probably want star.tmp, star.log, star.zip, star.orig. If you're in the middle of a merge conflict, you might get those files. Any other files that we just kind of accumulate, but we don't want to commit to our repository. And finally, secrets, the .env file. Now, in this case, in my application, I have an app settings.json. And here in my app settings, I'll probably have connection strings, and let's give it a MyDB, and we could pass in our details to our server. But in this case, we don't want to specify the server details here. We would end up committing those secrets. So I'm going to give us a hint and say, use environment variables. Cool. We kept our secrets out of source control. Kind of. We do have this development.json, and we could just as easily say connection strings, MyDB, and then put our secrets here. That would be bad. Instead, let's give ourselves a hint, use user secrets. Now that means that the moment that I start up my application and I connect to my database and it fails for the first time, I'll have a very specific clue that helps me understand how I do that. Now I happen to have this user secrets extension right here. User secrets. There we go. Netcore user secrets. And because of that, I can come in here and right-click on my project, and I can say manage user secrets. Now I don't yet have that secret in my project, so yes, please create me one. Now that put that line inside here, my user secret ID. Now this GUID is helpful, but it just needs to be a unique string. So I'll just call it level up DevOps. Now that I've got that string in place, let's go manage user secrets again. And now I can have the actual connection to my database that is not stored in source control. This file is in app data roaming. It's inside my user profile, far away from my source code. Excellent. Back to our git ignore. Close others. So we have those 5 groups of things that we're going to ignore from our source code repository. Downloaded files, built files, user-specific files, temp files, and secrets. We don't want these in our repository. OK, now we want to containerize our application. Our first stop here is to create a .dockerignore. .dockerignore. And the cool part is a dockerignore file is pretty much identical to a gitignore file. So let's go grab our gitignore file, copy, and paste. We're doing pretty good. Now there's a 6th group that we want in our dockerignore file, and this is non-production files. So I have my app settings, .development.json. I also have here inside my properties a launch settings.json, launch settings.json. Thanks, GitHub Copilot. And so now I've got all of the things that aren't production things ignored from my Docker thing. These are all the files that will never get copied into my environment. Launch. Thank you. Now, there's one difference between a dockerignore file and a gitignore file. Gitignore file will recursively look through all my directories to match something in any directory. By comparison, a dockerignore file will only look for it in my root directory. This one is inside the properties folder. So let me give it that nudge to say, in any directory, let me go find the launch settings.json. Now, arguably, I might want to do that everywhere. Put all of them in any directory. Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea. I'm lazy. Cool. Our 6 groups of things that we will never put in a Docker container, whether we want to or not. Our next step is a Dockerfile. New file, Dockerfile. Now, it's important that this be named Dockerfile and not dockerfile.txt. So if your IDE helped you, easy enough, come in here, rename it to just Dockerfile, and now we've got Dockerfile. Yeah, it is possible to rename it, but let's just leave it Dockerfile. Now I happen to have the VS Code extension for Docker here, so I get the really cool icons here that give me interesting things. I also get code completion, which is really nice. There are 4 main verbs inside of a Docker file: from, copy, run, and cmd. Now there are more commands, and we'll see some of them today. But if you understand these 4 commands, you'll be able to read and write pretty much every Docker file. And you'll be able to build up some really interesting Docker files: from, copy, run, and cmd. From. Now we want to stand on the shoulders of giants. We want to be able to build upon the works of others. So this is a .NET project. Let's head over to Docker Hub, and we'll search for .NET. And we will land here on this repository, which itself is a meta repository. I don't actually download from here. But it'll give me lots of different groups of things that I can download. Samples is great. Lots of different Docker files that I can choose from. Monitors, to be able to monitor .NET apps. Perhaps I can push those metrics into Prometheus and Grafana or OpenTelemetry. Runtime depths is everything I would need to install .NET, but it doesn't have .NET installed yet. Built on top of that is the runtime that allows me to run console apps but not websites. Built on top of that is ASP.NET that allows me to run websites but not build things. And on top of that is SDK that allows me to build things. So let's flip over to that one, the SDK, and let's take a look at the contents. There's the image name that we want. And if we scroll down a bit, we can see the other flavors, the other versions, the other labels associated with this image. Now, 7.0 is interesting. It's built on top of Debian 11. I might want to switch to Debian 12. But there's an Alpine one, and Alpine is a really small Linux variant. And so let's build on 7.0-Alpine instead. Back in our Docker file, from this -Alpine. And now we have our base image that has our build tools in it so that we can now start to do stuff. Let's copy everything from the directory where we'll run our Docker build command into the directory in our image. Now, what is this directory? Well, let's say work_dir/src. Now, this could be var lib foo bar. It could be anywhere that we want it to be, but I think src is a good spot. Now, this will both recursively create the directory and switch into it, which is perfect. So I copy everything from that directory where I run the Docker build command into this src directory. All of these files, except for everything that I've chosen to ignore. Next, I want to run some stuff. Now, if I was on a console, what would I type? Well, I would say .NET restore, and then .NET build. I'll build in release mode. .NET test, let me run all my unit tests. I'll also do this in release mode because otherwise I would end up with one release build and one debug build. I could also tell it no build and no restore. I'll skip that for now. .NET publish. In release mode, I'll go to the app directory. Now, these are all the commands that I would run on the command line to be able to build up my .NET app. If I was in a Node app, I might run npm build. If I was in a Python app, I might do pip install. The various command line tools that will get me from my source code to a running app. So now, how do we run them inside of a Docker image? Well, let's run this one. Let's run this one. Let's run this one. Now we have run them as commands within our Docker build. And it will run each of them and take the results and do what we need to do. CMD is that last one, which is the thing that we run as we start this image as a container. So let's do .NET level up DevOps.dll. Excellent. Now that's in the app directory, so let's change our workdir to /app. And let's set some environment variables. I need to set ASP.NET Core URLs to 80. I want to expose 80. Now that won't actually expose it, but it sets up the metadata associated with this so that I can understand where it is. And let me set up one more ASP.NET Core environment. I'll set that to production. And now my app knows to turn off all of the debugging stuff and run as efficiently as possible. Those 4 commands, from, copy, run, and CMD. And we saw a few more, but we now have a Docker file that will build a great container that can run in production. Almost. There's a few best practices that we can do to make this a little bit better. Right now, we have our build tools in our production container. Now, that's not a great best practice, because if anyone was able to pop the container and put in their own content, they could compile it into place, they could take over my running container. So let's head back out to Docker Hub, and we'll take a look at the ASP.NET container. Now, this one doesn't include the build tools, but it does include the runtime that it'll be able to run a website. Yeah, alternatively, I guess I could build outside the image and just copy in that resulting jar or ear or war or dist folder, but we want to build in a neutral environment. And this Dockerfile gives us a great neutral environment to be able to build in. Let's build here. So we found that ASP.NET base image. Scrolling down, we can see there is also an Alpine variant of this. So let's use 7.0-Alpine. So let's split this in half from that -Alpine. And now we are going to build 2 images instead of 1. This one will be our production runtime server image. And this one will be our build server image. Now, I put server in air quotes here because it's not really a server, it's an image. But we can kind of think of it like a server. This top one is going to do all the building. It has the build tools in it, and it does all that stuff. Then once it's done, then we build this one down here that does all the running so that we don't end up with our source code or our build tools inside of our production running image. That's pretty cool. Now, we're presuming that this content is in app. It isn't yet. So let's copy that content from this, well, let's call this dist over here. Let's copy the dist folder to our current folder, this app folder. But now it's going to look for a dist folder out here, which, by the way, we very specifically ignored right here. So let's not copy it from there. Let's copy it from equals build. Now, what is build? Well, let's name this one as build. Now, we could name this one as prod or something, but we're never going to use that name, so let's just leave it empty. Cool. We are no longer deploying build tools within our production image. We have built a multi-stage build that just copies those built assets into place, which means our running container is going to be really tiny. It's just Alpine, the .NET runtime, and our app. Now, there's one other thing that we can do here. Right now, we're copying all the files, and each one of these lines will get cached by Docker. And so next time we run it, if we haven't changed anything, it'll just use the cached image, and the build will be much faster locally. Now, in our CI server, we probably want to disable the cache so we get all the security updates and patch things according to the Semver rules that we've chosen. But here, if I come in here and I say change a JavaScript file or a CSS file, that will invalidate this image, this layer, and therefore I will re-restore my dependencies. Now, that's probably the slowest part of this process, is downloading all those dependencies. So really, I want to do that first, and then copy in all my files, and then build, test, and publish. That makes a little bit more sense. Now, if I change some CSS or JavaScript, or maybe even come in and change some C#, it's not going to invalidate my NuGet packages that I've downloaded. It will only invalidate the build. Perfect. Now, I do need to give it my manifest. So let's copy in level up devops.csproj into the current directory, and now it knows which packages it needs to restore. Then we'll restore. Then we'll copy in everything else. Then we'll build, test, and publish. And then we'll switch over to this other image where we're going to set some environment variables. And as the very last step, we'll copy that content from the dist directory into our production image. That means that if I change a C# file, we'll invalidate this layer and not have to restore our NuGet packages and only do the minimal content that we need to be able to do it. Now, these aren't the only best practices, but these two best practices got us from a Dockerfile that was pretty good to a Dockerfile that's doing rather well. Now, we could definitely argue about running as root. Yes, it's beyond the scope to do a user line here and talk about how we would then have to create that user and things like that. So I'll just assume that we're running as root, and that's OK. We've got a Docker file. We've got a Docker ignore file. We've got a git ignore file and a website. I think we're ready to commit to source control. Any thoughts or concerns, any questions or adjustments that we should make right here before we do it? Excellent. So our goal is to commit this to GitHub. We have these 5 groups of things that we're ignoring: secrets, temp files, user-specific files, built files, downloaded files. So let's flip over here to source control and see how we did. Well, we've got some libraries that we downloaded here. I think we might be able to do a little bit better here. Let's head off to CDN.js, and let's take a look at Bootstrap, and let's see if we can eliminate that. OK, so I want to grab bootstrap.bundle.min.cs. Let me copy that script tag, or the CSS tag, rather. And let's come here into our files, and here inside our views, in layout.cshtml, we will replace that Bootstrap reference with a CDN reference. Great. Now we're using Cloudflare's bandwidth instead of our own. Now, if this was an internal app, it's probably faster to load off the LAN than off of the internet. But if we have the public-facing website, that gets that content out of our repository. Excellent. So let's do that down here for Bootstrap, and apparently we have jQuery for reasons. So let's replace both Bootstrap and jQuery there. And we've got one more spot right here where we're pulling in a few jQuery plugins. And so let's grab CDN references there as well. And now, because we've replaced that, let's come into www.root, and we've removed our need for these 4 libraries. Excellent. Let's just delete this. Delete. Cool. Back here, we can take a look at our content. Yep, we've got a Docker file, a Docker ignore file, we've got our website, and just those few things. Here in VS Code, I could pull up each file and show what it was and what it is. But in this case, it's, well, all brand new. So that may not be as helpful. Next up, let's create a README that talks about our repository. I'll create this new file, readme.md, and let's copy some content in there. Here's a good description of our project. Our application, it's a live demo of GitHub Actions and deploying Docker containers to Kubernetes. That looks good. Oh, we're going to go to Kubernetes. Let's create a Kubernetes YAML file. So I'm going to create a new file, k8s.yaml. And now we've got Spot to build up our Kubernetes YAML files. Now, I chose to install this VS Code extension, the Microsoft Kubernetes extension right here. And because I have this VS Code extension, I get some great templates that will help me with this. So I can come in here, and I can say, I would like a deployment. And it says, yes, there's all the deployment details. Level up DevOps. I'm doing pretty good. I'm going to take out this resources section. I'll just leave it as blank for now. The port that I brought in is port 80. What is my image? Well, it'll be ACR URL dash level up DevOps. I'll give it a version of image label. And these will be things that we'll swap in at build time. So image label, ACR URL, the private container registry. I don't want to check in these secrets into my source control, so I'll just put in helpers there. I do want to say replicas 1, and let's give it another label of version image label, and we'll also put that here too. Cool. We've got our deployment. Next up, we want a service that will load balance across that. So let's type in service, and it will build up our service, level up DevOps. That will reach to our level up DevOps app. Now, I'm not going to put the version here because I want it to take effect for all versions. And so then I need only update my deployment for next round. That's pretty cool. I'll forward it to port 80 from port 80. If I wanted to, I could switch to type node port if I really needed that extra port. In this case, I think a cluster IP will work. And then next up, I want an ingress. There's a Kubernetes ingress, level up DevOps. That's great. What is my host? Level up DevOps.aks URL. I'll swap that in at runtime as well. It'll forward off to my service, level up DevOps on port 80. And now let's add some security details. I want to be able to do HTTPS stuff. So back here in my Kubernetes YAML file, let's add some annotations that will give it details from Let's Encrypt. And then in our spec, we will give it some more details that will also give us reference to Let's Encrypt. So let's give it an ingress class name of Nginx. We'll set the host name. Now, we've already got a secret in Kubernetes set up, but if not, then the Let's Encrypt container would automatically fill that secret with the correct URL. Great. So now that we've got that content in place, let's double check and make sure I didn't typo that. Yeah, that's, oh, we forgot the environment variable. Yes, let's do environment variables. So one of the things that I set here in my Dockerfile was that, or in my app settings, was this environment variable to connect to my database. Now, I could call out here in my Dockerfile, let's set another environment variable, connection strings, 2 underscores, my DB, and I'm going to set that to blank. Now, that doesn't really help me because it doesn't set the environment variable to anything, but it does kind of nicely hint that I need to set it. Now, why do I have these 2 underscores? That's the convention that ASP.NET uses to kind of nest through these nested elements inside of my app JSON file here, app settings. So let me set that there. So now that I've got that environment variable set, let's come back into our Kubernetes YAML file and set some environment details. Now I've got a name of that and a value of, well, I'll probably have Azure DB, nope, server equals Azure DB something. And well, now I've got that Kubernetes content in that secret in the content that I would deploy. So probably I want to pull this from a secret instead. So right now I'll just leave that as a to-do to switch that over to a secret. Cool. Now that we've got an environment variable set in our Kubernetes YAML file that will come through our container and into our application, now our application knows how to connect to the database. So let's commit this. Taking a look at all the content, looks like we've got exactly what we need and no more. Let's stage all that. Level up DevOps. Yeah, breaking convention of not calling it initial commit. Okay. Now that we've got our content in place, git status, git push origin main, and we've now deployed that content up to GitHub. So if you come hit that URL, the GitHub URL from robrich.org/presentations, we now have content in a repository. So you could now clone this repository or fork it and get exactly the content that we built. So now let's build a DevOps pipeline. I'm going to come in here to Actions, and we can see that we have lots of templates to choose from. Now notice that this was a Docker image and gave me that template. We have a bunch of deployment templates, a bunch of security scanner templates, lots of different things to help us get started past the blank page. And if we really want to, we can set up a workflow ourselves, which will just give us a completely blank document to start from. Now, I'm going to start from the Docker image, because that looks like a good spot. I'm going to change this to Docker Kubernetes.yaml. And I will say Docker build and push, Kubernetes start, Kubernetes run. There we go. So now we're building this YAML file up in the GitHub environment. Let's do this when we push to the main branch. That looks good. We'll come back to pull requests, but we do want to do this. Workflow dispatch. Now, workflow dispatch gives us the ability to push a run now button. Have you ever tried to commit just like a carriage return or a space because you want to kick off the build? And then somebody goes, hey, you just committed like 12 times and you didn't say anything? No, I'll squash it, but I already pulled it, and so now, yeah, workflow dispatch gives us a run button up here where we can just kick off the build again without having to commit garbage just to run the build. Okay, so what are we going to do? Well, we'll start off by checking out our content. Now let's do Docker build and push, kubectl apply. And instead of just running one command, we'll run a bunch of commands. And now we can specify each of the commands that we want to run. So I'm going to do a Docker build. The file is Dockerfile, so I don't need that. I'll tag it as level up DevOps and latest, and give it that dot, that build context that tells it where to kick off the build. That kind of matches in here in my Dockerfile where I said copy from that folder where I ran the build command. Excellent. So we're doing the build, but we want to tag it with our registry. Now, this was an almost empty repository. It wasn't quite empty. There was one spot that I did here. I said secrets, actions. I came in here and created some secrets. I just said new repository secret. I gave it a name and a value and created a bunch of secrets. Now, I could definitely create environment-specific secrets, branch-specific things that might deploy to dev versus production. But I've got these secrets. The secrets to my private registry, URL, password, and username, the URL of my production repository, and also the kube config. I went into my user profile, and I'm definitely not going to open up that file live on stage, but I went in and took a look at my kube config. I deleted all of the Docker desktop certificate data, and so now I have the details for my production cluster that allows me to be able to connect to that cluster, and I'll use this kube config to be able to do my build. So back here, now that we've got those secrets, now I want to be able to use that secret to be able to label this thing with my registry name. So let's head over to the GitHub docs and take a look at how we might do secrets. Well, yep, we went into settings, we went into secrets, we added a secret. So we've got that done. Now, how might we use them in a workflow? Well, I'll do it with this. We've got curly brace, secrets.thatthing. And so let's copy this, come back over here into our thing, and we'll say, let's do this as ACR URL. Excellent. Keep those secrets out of our GitHub repository. Now that will be the URL to my Docker container registry, and let's also give it a version. Instead of latest, we'll give it github.sha. That's the Git hash associated with this build. Now that's definitely not semver, but it is unique for each build. As I commit a new thing, it will kick off a new unique version in my Docker container registry, and that will allow me to be able to identify what source code produced this build. Okay, Docker push, and let's push that image up to that registry. Now, we haven't logged in yet, so this is definitely going to fail. So let's come here to the marketplace and start talking about how we might log in. Docker login. Now, this GitHub action is great. It kind of gives us the details of how we might use this, and we can pull open the details, link probably to their GitHub page of how they built this, details about how to use it, and that's interesting information. I'm going to just take a look here at this sample, and let's put this sample right there. Okay, so this is the task that will do that Docker login process. So to log in, it needs a few details. It needs a registry. We have a secret for that, secrets.acr URL. And it needs a username. We have one of those, secrets.username. It needs a password. We have one of those. Here's our secrets.acr password. And then we don't need ECR in this case. We're actually deploying to Azure, though that's just an implementation detail. And then log out. Well, what is log out? It's not log out at the end of this task, but rather log out at the end of the build. Now, if we're on a shared host, we don't want the next build to be able to inherit our authentication details. We want them to log into their own registry. Now, up here on GitHub with hosted runners, they're going to throw away our virtual machine after the build, so it'll be fine. But it's good code sanity to good code steps to be able to log out, clear the secrets after our build. Excellent. So now our Docker push will run. That's great. Next up, kubectl apply-f k8s.yaml. Now, we're also not logged into Kubernetes yet. So let's come back here into the GitHub task marketplace and look for kubectl set context. That's not it. Kubernetes set context. There we go. Kubernetes set context. I could definitely look at the full details, but I'll just copy the YAML that I need right here, set it in place. Let's indent it a little bit differently. And this gives me the details that I need to be able to log into Kubernetes. Now it's going to start off asking me what method. I've got a kube config. Because I have a kube config, I don't need the majority of the rest of this. Let's say this is a secrets.kubeconfig, and go delete all the rest of these details because we're not using that methodology. Excellent. Now we're authenticated to our Kubernetes cluster, and we can do a kubectl apply. But here in our Kubernetes YAML file, we have a few things that we want to swap into place based on secrets. So let's come back here and we'll adjust this to be able to swap in those secrets. Now, to save a smidge of typing, I'll just paste that in here. We are going to, in our Kubernetes YAML file, we're going to replace things with sed, no backup. ACR URL will replace with the secret, AKS URL also with the secret, image label with the GitHub SHA, and all that in our Kubernetes YAML file. Now, I very specifically chose to put that here because if I were to say put it here above the Docker build command, and if I was, say, I don't know, really lazy and forgot here in my Docker ignore file to exclude the k8s.yaml file, then I would accidentally get my Kubernetes YAML file with the secrets embedded in my image. Now, that would be bad because now if you were able to pop my container, you could get my deployment secrets in addition to my runtime secrets. That's not good. So let's move this down here. We're going to build and push our image, get it off the machine before we start talking about the secrets in the Kubernetes YAML file. That'll be a little bit more secure. Great. Now we've got a GitHub Actions build command. It'll check out the latest source code, log into Docker, log into Kubernetes, build, push, and deploy. And so let's save this. I'm going to commit the change, create DevOps build, and it will commit this as just a regular file in my GitHub project. Now, it's just a regular file, but if I clicked on this edit button, I could get back to the marketplace and be able to add additional things. But because it is just a file, git pull, I could start to change this and improve it here in my source code editor as well. So we can continue editing it wherever it makes sense. Now, because I've enabled it and because it's here in this .github/workflows folder, what it did was it kicked off a build. Here's our build. Let's go into the details for that build and see how we did, see how many typos I did. So we checked out our source code, logged into Docker, set our context. We're running all of the steps in our Dockerfile. We're doing the .NET restore, .NET build, .NET test. We've successfully built and published now. Let's flip over to our other image. We've now deployed correctly, and this content is running inside of Kubernetes. Now, it'll take a while for that DNS to update. And so the DNS here in our Kubernetes YAML file. And so I don't really want to wait for that to finish. So let's actually proxy in. We'll head off to the Kubernetes docs where we can look at port forwarding. We could port forward into a pod or into a deployment, into a service. Hey, that looks good. Let's come back in here, kubectl get all. We can see that our site is now running inside of Azure. That's excellent. And let's say kubectl port forward service/level up DevOps. I'll forward port 80 from my local machine to port 80 on the service. But maybe there's something running on port 80 on my machine. So I'll forward port 8080 from my local machine into port 80 inside of Kubernetes. Now that I've got that set up, let's head off to localhost 8080. And we can see the website that we built half an hour ago running in Kubernetes right now. Woo! Our build went green. That was fun. Now, there's a couple more things that we can touch up. We completely skipped pull requests. Let's come back to that one. And let's also take a look at a README. So I want to come back in here. Let's come into our actions and into our build. And I'm going to say, create status badge, please. Copy that status badge. I'll come back here into my readme.markdown. And let's put the status badge there. That will give us a green if our build is green, a red if our build fails. It'll be a nice indicator. And then let's also come in here and talk about pull requests. Now, we could definitely do things like if the GitHub ref is refs heads main and start to talk about how we want to adjust this build based on how that works. But I'm just going to start with a completely new file, dockerpr.yaml. Now, our build is going to be significantly different, so let's just do a different one. Now, I'll do all the branches that are not main, and I'll do pull request on all branches. Now, why do I do 2 of them? Well, if I have internal collaborators that are working on my project, they're probably going to create a feature branch and then a pull request that way. So this will get their builds. And if I have external collaborators in my open source project and they fork the project into their repository, then they'll create a pull request and I'll catch their build here. I was able to capture both of those places. That's excellent. Do I want a trigger to pull this off? Yeah, I don't mind that build button. Now this is going to be a little bit different. I definitely don't want to deploy to Kubernetes. It's just a pull request. If I'm not going to deploy to Kubernetes, I don't need to log into Kubernetes. I don't need to set my secrets there inside of Kubernetes. I probably also don't want to push this to my container registry. I don't want to happen upon this pull request image someday and go, let me deploy that one. And that means I also don't need to Docker login. That I just don't need those credentials running on this thing. And to that end, maybe I won't even tag it with that secret. I'll just call this levelupdevops-pr as my image name. That build is a lot simpler. I'm just running Docker build and not pushing it anywhere. Now, I am still doing all of the steps in my Dockerfile, so I am still building, testing, and publishing. If my tests fail or if my build doesn't compile correctly, I still will fail the build, fail that PR, but I'm not deploying to Kubernetes. Excellent. So let's come in here. What changes did we make? Yep, we added that build hash. Ooh, good thing we caught that secret there, and we'll commit that part. We also have 2 new files. Let's say add a PR build and commit that. Last time we pushed from the command line. Today, let's push from from VS Code. And now, if we update our repository, we see that we also now have details. Well, we have that nice status badge, but because we committed to the main branch, we also kicked off a new build. Last time we went in this way. This time, let's go in this way. I'll click on Actions. I can pick the particular build that I want to run. But in this case, there's the build. It's showing me all of them right now. And now it's already doing the steps. OK, so we set the workdir to app. Remember that line in our Dockerfile. Then we're going to copy all of our content. .NET restore, so we're restoring all of our dependencies. That looks great. Now that we've got that, let's run a build. Hopefully I didn't typo anything. Yep, the build succeeded. Excellent. Now let's run the tests. I don't have any tests, so I don't have any failing tests. So there aren't any tests passed. We'll publish it, switch over to the other image, and we'll push that up to our container registry. Now we'll go kick that off inside of Kubernetes, and it looks like it failed. Where did it fail? The deployment level up DevOps is invalid. Ooh, field is immutable. Yes, I think I typoed it right here. I need to leave that off. Excellent. Now, I could definitely push this up, but one of the things that we saw here was because we set that version inside of Kubernetes, kubectl get all, we can take a look at the pod and see what version of the pod it's running. Now here's that pod that we kicked off last time. So kubectl describe that pod. And in the labels, we can see that the label, it has this version, DBA 85A3 AE. And that, by the way, git log --1 line is the current Git hash that we deployed last time. So once I fix this build and push it, we'll be able to see that the new version is up there as well. And I'm just curious if I commit this, git push or git commit fix typo, git push origin main, if that might fix it. So this was cool. We started with nothing. We built up a DevOps pipeline. We live coded a git ignore and a docker ignore. We live coded a Dockerfile. Remember those 5 things that we want to ignore in Git and those 4 verbs that we had in a Dockerfile? We built up a Kubernetes YAML file. The majority of it was templated, and we were able to deploy that to a running site inside of Kubernetes. Now the cool part, this content that we just built right now is online right now. And so when you go to the next session and they say, nope, I'm going to post the slides on my site tonight, The code is online right now. This was really fun getting to show you how to level up your DevOps in GitHub Actions and Kubernetes. Thanks for coming. Do we have time for questions? Any thoughts or concerns other than I just failed the build because I typoed something? Awesome. Oh, yes.
So in this case, will man in the middle, those attacks still work?
Ooh, yeah, I hid all the secrets, so how might those attacks work? Yep, there are no secrets here in my GitHub repository, with the exception of I left this one as an experiment to the reader here in my Kubernetes YAML file. But I made sure that none of the secrets were in my source code. None of them were committed into my image. But yeah, how might they attack my image? Well, at the end of the day, the secrets are inside the pod. So if I said kubectl describe that pod, then we can see that the connection string is right there. How would they steal that? Well, if they could remote into my container and enumerate the environment variables, yeah, they might still be able to steal my secrets. But that's pretty much the only place that they can get it, and only that secret. All the deployment secrets are still safe. Great thought, I love that. Thank you. Excellent. Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for letting me play.